If you're an average player, you want to be left alone, right? Because you want to be able to slide by. If you're a good player, you want to be coached. If you're a great player, you want the coach to tell you the truth every day. Did I hustle on that play? Did I make the right read? Did I play the guy with the right leverage? You want to know every play. Because you know why? They want to be perfect. Everybody here makes a choice to do one of those three things.
Welcome to the GOAT Consulting Podcast, a podcast dedicated to people striving to be a GOAT, the greatest of all time, serving it up in a way that you can get it in all stages of life.
Hey, I'm Colby Jubenville, and welcome to another episode of the GOAT Consulting Podcast right here at VC Productions in studio in Nashville, Tennessee. Always at the table with me is my good friend Tyler Burnett, the CEO and founder of the GOAT family of brands, with his latest and greatest polo. And then to the left, the LinkedIn whisperer, the calming force to our show, with no T-shirt to show today, John Byers. John, thank you so much for being here. Welcome. Tyler, we appreciate you coming in. We always like to thank our friends at Dev Digital and for the great work that they do, continuing to be a friend of the show and support of the show and setting the bar so high when it comes to all things digital in Nashville, Tennessee.
They bring the energy.
They do bring the energy.
Just like Colby.
Yeah. Get out of the sand trap and get back up on the green. So we got a great show for you today. The show is around rivalries, and this is something that was interesting to you that you saw, and we see rivalry in sports, right? We see rivalry: Green Bay Packers versus the Chicago Bears, L.A. versus the Celtics, Bird versus Magic. The list goes on and on. But
I sense some goats in there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in sports, what do we say? It's easy to see.
It is.
But in business, it's people that compete on unique perspective, education, and experience. What they do gives them energy, and it gives other people energy, creates new levels of challenge and new levels of opportunity. And that really is the story for today, a story of rivalries.
Yes.
Unexpected rivalries.
Yeah, and I was reading a book that I've probably referenced before a couple years ago when I started, called Infinite Game by Sinek. And fascinating book, kind of reshapes a lot of how I think about winning and losing and how he goes into that. But one of the terms that he actually brings up in this book and speaks to is worthy rivals. And so as I started kind of doing my own research on that and looking up a few things, I really kind of focused in on this story of Alan Mulally, who left Boeing in 2006 to become the CEO of Ford. And in one of his first interviews, a reporter asked him, said, "Alan, what kind of car do you drive?" And Alan says, "I drive a Lexus," which got a lot of tilted heads in the crowd. And he said, and when asked why, he said, "Because it's the finest car in the world."
Absolutely.
Now, I might contend that because I've had a Lexus, and I'm not sure I would quite agree, but he believed it. And maybe that was the case in 2006. And what I loved about that is he preferred the truth even when it was uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, here he is in a moment taking over Ford, 2006. And by the way, Ford was like on the brink of bankruptcy at this point when he was taking over. And I believe he was offering Ford one of the greatest gifts they would ever receive in the company history, and that was a worthy rival in Lexus.
The worthy rival.
Yes.
So they needed to have a rivalry in order to be able to become the company that they were supposed to become.
Yeah.
And if you look at all great rivalries, what do? They elevate the play of those around them.
Absolutely. Yeah, and he goes on to like bring an entire fleet of Lexus vehicles into Ford, not to copy what they did, but to like study them. They wanted, and in this process, they decided they didn't want to be Lexus, but they wanted to be great in similar ways that Lexus had become great. And so it was this co-elevation. I don't even know at the time it was a co-elevation. They were being elevated by the good work that Lexus had done. And I think it's just a fascinating story of humility and confidence and goatness.
Well, I mean, you said it earlier about part of our motto here is about unique education and unique perspective. I think what he was trying to do is change the perspective because, they thought they were successful, right, in their own minds. I'm sure most of those people had started at Ford and just been at Ford, but until you're willing to open up to different perspectives, you think you're at the top.
Yeah, one of the things Mulally is known for is he came into and saw a culture where they cared more about themselves versus the company itself. And so there was a shift in focus, and I think probably it took him saying, and look over here, look at how this company, Lexus, is doing it, and we could be doing it in a way that's either similar or better, and that is somebody that we're going to compete against on a daily basis, which that doesn't seem intuitive to me, right? Do you think about Ford competing with Lexus?
I don't, and I think that's what they got super clear on at the time. They didn't want to compete with Lexus in terms of the types of, certainly the audience and the consumer, but somebody that buys a Lexus is typically not, in the business of also owning a Ford, right? So it's two different types of customers. But how they were executing, how they were excellent in their creation and what they were innovating, that was so unique, and they wanted to bring that type of culture to Ford that they had not had up to this point.
Yeah.
And it made me, and let me just go ahead and share, you mentioned the no T-shirt today. It's very intentional, and I struggled with this, but out of respect for you, I did not wear my University of Georgia national champion T-shirt today.
Because?
Well, because you, I think it might stunt your ability to do this show in such a great way. But I would say, this is not my GOAT, but I would say that UGA, one of the biggest reasons they won this year was because of their worthy rival in Alabama. And when I think about some of the greatest rivals in college sports, I might not necessarily put UGA and Alabama there. They certainly have become that in the last few years. But there's others like Auburn and Florida that Georgia Tech in some ways have competed with over the years. But I believe one of the biggest reasons Georgia won the title this year was because of Alabama. But I didn't wear the shirt. So I'm going to share GOAT.
Okay.
And by the way, you mentioned some. There are many other worthy rivals, right? You've got Apple and Microsoft, and maybe Tyler will mention one here. But I'm going to go with the greatest villain of all time, the Joker.
Yeah.
Greatest villain of all time. And he was the first villain to ever get his own movie, by the way, that was solely focused on the Joker. And I don't think Batman is as great as we see him today, if not for the Joker. And, as we look at some of the other ways the Joker has become elevated in film, you've got Jack Nicholson, who played the first Joker years back when the first Batman movie came out. You have Heath Ledger, who played him a few years ago. And then when Joker got his own movie, Joaquin Phoenix played him, which is a fascinating film, by the way. It won all kinds of awards. But all three of those guys won Oscars for playing the role of the Joker.
Wow.
There's not been a villain ever in film that has been as decorated as the Joker.
And so the Joker couldn't be the Joker without Batman, and Batman couldn't be Batman without the Joker.
Which is precisely what a worthy rival is. And I pointed out a few things just because I tend to look at a little deeper, but why is the Joker so good? And why do we connect with him as an audience in such a way? At least for me, I'm partially making this up, but he wasn't originally bad. If you watch this solo film where Joaquin Phoenix is the Joker, he wasn't originally bad, but he was a bad product of his circumstances. The audience, us, we sympathize with him because of that. And then, of course, he's got this uncontrollable laughter. That's what makes him so good at being such a unique and the greatest villain of all time.
Well, I think if you look at that relationship between the Joker and Batman, I think what it really illustrates, and it's certainly seen in Mulally and his approach, is that the first thing that kind of rivalry does. You call it worthy rivalry. Is that what Sinek says in his book? He calls it.
Yep.
I think the worthy rivalry does three things. Number one, it provides performance enhancing opportunities, right? Because the Joker every time that he goes to engage with Batman, he tries to one-up him.
He does.
And then Batman comes back and tries to then one-up him.
Yep.
And the movie really is about performance enhancing, providing that performance enhancing. I think that's one big piece to it. I think the second worthy goal, based on your example of the Joker and Batman, helps you stay committed to achieving your goal. Every time that the Joker does something, what does Batman say? We got to achieve the goal. And what is the goal? To keep everybody safe. And who do we keep them safe from?
The Joker.
The Joker. So number 2 is to achieve the goal.
Committed.
Stay committed. That's right. To achieving the goal. And then the last is strengthen your motivation to win. Strengthen your motivation to win. I think those are the things when I think about the Joker and Batman. Those 3 things are the things that drove Mullally in looking at a worthy rival, and I think he was smart to see that.
Yeah, they push you to be your best self, right? You think about starting
Absolutely.
quarterbacks. You think about starting shortstops. A lot of the time early on in the season, there's a huge rivalry, a huge run to who's going to be the starting quarterback. So without those guys maybe get laxed a little bit and don't push as hard.
100%.
So that brings me to my GOAT, Nike and Reebok. So Reebok originally kind of came out with the pumps, right, in the tongue where you could pump right there. And then
I love those.
And then I loved them too. And I love Shaquille O'Neal when he kind of signed the deal with them. That brought some more attention to Reebok. But then, Nike had the Air Max shoe where they kind of did the same thing that you didn't have to pump that was in the bottom of the shoe. Another comfort level, right? So it was those 2 rivalries pushing each other to put the best product out there. And maybe Reebok never tries to put a pump in the tongue of the shoe if it wasn't for competition like Nike. And maybe Nike doesn't find a way to try to enclose air underneath the sole or in the sole of the shoe. I mean, just think about that. What innovation that took to say, let's make us feel like we're walking on clouds here, and let's trap air underneath. I mean, I think that's pretty special.
Yeah.
And it drives innovation, right? Like we
does.
just talked about. I was having a conversation with my team this morning before we left, and a lot of our business is driven around dog parks, right? So it's, turfing a dog park so you don't have mud and those kind of things, making those spaces clean, right? Whether it's a backyard, whether it's a dog park, apartment complex, or whatnot. And when we first got in the business, everybody was just putting turf down. Whether it was me or somebody from out of town or somebody from in town, one of my rivalries, or just putting turf down. But the conversation we had today was, how do we make these dog parks more unique? How do we we're building one at Berry Farms right now where we have
Put a cat in it.
a concrete,
See what happens.
put a concrete pipe where the dogs can run through a tunnel, right? Where there's one seesaw coming up, there's a dog bath. How do we get more creative and be more innovative? And part of that I would have never thought about if it wasn't for competition.
There's no doubt that a worthy rival makes you better, makes you think harder, perform better, train harder. And we could go on. I mean, you've got Coke and Pepsi, and you've got all these others that just are better because of the other. And that really brings me to a point around Mullally, because 2 years after taking over as the CEO of Ford, which, by the way, remember, they were almost ready to file bankruptcy. 2 years later was 2008 when we hit the financial crisis. And this is fascinating to me. Ford was the only U.S.-based car manufacturer that did not receive government assistance because of the turnaround that Mullally had created in only a 2-year time frame. Ford was the only one. You had GMC and you had Chrysler both asking the government for a bailout. And in fact, they called Mullally to testify in front of Congress as to whether or not he thought GM and Chrysler should get the bailout. And everybody knew what he was going to say, right? Yeah. He's going to testify. He's going to say, of course they shouldn't get it. Ford would dominate the market, or they'd get GM and Chrysler for some dirt cheap, and they'd own all of it, right? And Mullally gets up in front of Congress and he says, I'm going to endorse the bailout for both of these guys. We, as Ford, are better because of them. We need them to be as good as we are today and even better tomorrow. he understood the impact that worthy rivals had on his business. In fact, he went on to talk about the suppliers that nobody had thought about that would be negatively impacted if GM and Chrysler had gone out of business, because those are the same suppliers he was using that then would have impacted his business and then his customers and the effect that it would have had on the market. So this guy's fascinating, and one of the things that I love about that, and I love that I kind of garnered from that about a worthy rival, is that they keep the game in play.
Mm.
The reason that Joker, or the reason that Coke or University of Georgia or Apple or whomever it is, Nike, right, or Reebok, the reason those guys are great worthy rivals is because they keep upping the game, just like you talked about. They keep the game in play, and that's one of the things that a worthy rival does.
Yeah, before Mullally was hired, Ford had lost its way. Instead of acting, it was reacting, and I'm pulling these from the notes that I had. It was making cars that nobody wanted to buy because union contracts prohibited layoffs. Its vehicles were boring because bean counters undermined the work of designers and knew that every organization needed a clear and compelling vision. And I think that's probably why he looked to have a worthy rival. Is if you look at, when does a rival become worthy? When does it become worthy? When it impacts not only the rivalry itself, but it impacts the entire system. It impacts the entire culture. It impacts an entire generation. And what he saw was an opportunity to address this very thing in the culture problems inside of Ford by having a rivalry that says, and here's who we're going to go out and compete against on a daily basis. In a way, I hate to say this, but in a way, much like Georgia looked at Alabama and knew that Alabama was the Lexus and still is of college football, and Georgia.
Can I check the pulse here?
They're not.
I don't feel much.
In Georgia,
they're not the Lexus for another 44 weeks. They're not. Another 44 weeks.
Oh,
at least.
That's heartbreaking for you, isn't it?
Those have been some great games.
They were.
But I think those rivalries help create a great leader too. You know, because he could have easily, like you said, just said no. I don't support a bailout, and sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees.
One of the things I would ask Mullally is, like, he wasn't about beating the rivalry. That's what I think's fascinating, because if he was about winning, if he was about winning over a competition, and certainly there is something meaningful about that, right? Like, he would have said they don't get the bailout. Ford would have gone on for at least a time and dominated the market. But he doesn't, and that's what I think is so fascinating. I would want to lean in with him and say, what do you think about winning and losing? I think he would blow our minds with what he might respond, because I don't think it was about that for him. Worthy rivals aren't about winning and losing; they're about elevating.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
it's an interesting concept.
I think that's if you go back to Joker and Batman, it's that the franchise goes on. The latest Batman, well, it's about what fans go in there hoping to experience what the next elevation of the rivalry between those two.
Absolutely right.
So do you have to have a rivalry to up your competition, to up your game, to improve your performance?
Tell me one scenario in the history of the universe where something great didn't happen, something great happened where a worthy rival wasn't in play.
Oh man,
David and Goliath. I mean, that's not where it's not, but I mean, I'm thinking of everything.
Rival.
There's always a
worthy rival.
Yeti and what's the other one that's here out of Nashville? Orca.
Yeti and Orca. So there's not one.
I can't think of one. I couldn't think of one. When anything great happens, there's a worthy rival involved.
When anything great happens, there's a worthy rival.
So it's worth us paying attention to.
Yeah.
And worth us leaning into why, rather than trying to beat a worthy rival. How do we study them in a way that Mullally brought a whole fleet of Lexus cars to the Ford plant, study them in such a way that's going to help elevate our game, make us better, do great things. I feel like we're pounding the topic here. But.
Well, it's the worthy rival. And I think that's the focus, right? It's something different to think about. If you think about business and leadership, it is not counterintuitive. It is not intuitive to think. It's counterintuitive to say, I'm going to look at somebody else in order to see how we can up our game. But when you take those moments and you look at the examples that we've given today, the NBA was on the verge of collapse until Bird
Johnson
and Magic Johnson established that rivalry.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it helps the end user too, the consumer, right? Because
Absolutely.
You're constantly working on quality, which the definition of quality is delivering a better, gooder service at a reduced cost.
There you go.
So you think about, let's just say Walgreens, for instance, if there was no other competitor, the prices of their stuff could be $100 instead of $10, right? So if those companies don't push themselves to deliver quality at a reduced cost, then the end user is the one who has the issue there. So I think it's good for our economy. It's good for everything. Good for the end user. It's good for the company.
When Apple decided to follow, by the way, their worthy rival Microsoft in coming out with their similar version of Microsoft's PC, Microsoft put out an ad that said, I forget exactly the wording, but it was like, welcome to the world of personal computers, Apple.
Yeah.
Like, I just thought it was so cool. Like, they didn't try to trash them, but it was like, glad you're here.
Glad you're late, but glad you're here.
Yeah, like, I think there was probably a little bit of tongue-in-cheek in there all at the same time, but I thought it was such a cool ad that they put out just to say, welcome to the game.
Welcome to the game.
Well, and it makes me think a little bit, back to our Southwest deal, right? And your Toyota and Lexus comparison. Like, the market needs different kinds of companies, right? There's people who love Southwest. There's people who love American, people who love Delta, and they love it for different reasons.
Yeah.
And it's hard for one company to appease everybody. So I think that's another thing that makes the market great too. If you loved American Airlines, you loved their style, but you only had a Southwest option, you probably just wouldn't fly. And so then you might taint the flying or what you think about flying. So I think it's good to have different culture, different vision, and different suppliers.
Yeah, it's the feeling of uniqueness and excitement that comes along with that. So not only internally, like Mulally used with Ford and Lexus, you can see it happen externally and the excitement that's created. And we're very much looking forward to the Alabama-Georgia rivalry.
I'm watching that with you guys.
If that's what you want to call that. I don't know if I've ever heard it all the way until now, but we're going to give that to John Byers for today. We're going to say, John, for today that the Alabama-Georgia rivalry is alive and well, and so is the Auburn and Alabama rivalry, and really the rivalry between Alabama and everybody else.
Well, what do you get excited for in sports? Basketball. I don't watch any basketball this year. We just had a rivalry week.
John just sits here and smiles as he knows that I've got to wait for another 344 days to see that game again.
44 weeks.
8 weeks today.
44. Is it really?
8 weeks today.
44 weeks. So if you're out in the market, I do suggest that you go look for a Lexus over a Ford, but we'll have that in another episode. For Tyler Burnett and John Byers, I'm Colby Jubenville. This is a rivalry week at the Go Consulting Podcast.
Boom.